G'day. Just to set the record straight, in this video I thought I would clear up some more very common misconceptions. This time regarding motorcycle clutches and gear changes. I don't believe in making videos any longer than they need to be, crapping on with boring details, etc. So without any more buggering around, let's get into it. First up, these things are quite often referred to as suicide shifters or jockey shifters. But even though some companies do sell and advertise them using these terms, because it sounds really cool, in fact they have no idea what they are talking about. There is absolutely no such thing as a suicide shifter. They just do not exist and never have. They are actually just called a tank shifter or a hand shifter and nothing else. Because, you guessed it, you operate it with your hand. It's just that simple. But if the hand gear change lever is mounted down here, it is then called a jockey shifter because of the resemblance a rider changing gears has to a jockey when he is whipping a racehorse. This is an arse, and a bloody nice one too if I do say so myself.
Oh yeah.
But if you do not have to reach under your arse to change gears, and again it's pretty simple and straightforward, your bike does not have a jockey shifter. Many old bikes also had foot clutches, and many books and websites quite often refer to these as suicide clutches. But again, in almost every case, this is not true either. Most old American-made motorcycles actually had what is correctly termed a rocker clutch. And there are very important distinctions between the two. Rocker clutches operate quite differently to a suicide clutch. A rocker clutch has two pedals, similar to a modern heel-toe gear change lever. But a rocker clutch holds its position, whether it's either engaged or disengaged by means of a spring or some other kind of mechanism. For example, a rocker clutch on an old Harley, when pressed forward, engages the clutch, whereas the old V-twin Indians were the exact opposite. You would press on the rear pedal with your heel to engage the clutch. If a rider's foot happened to slip off a rocker clutch while the pedal is disengaged, it stays disengaged. Rocker clutches are definitely not suicide clutches, and they are a lot safer. On the other hand, a suicide clutch, which was fitted to such bikes as the Indian 4s, only have the one pedal, and these work exactly the same as a clutch in a manual gear change car. You press the clutch forward to disengage the clutch, then change into gear, and upon its release, the clutch engages and the bike moves forward. These clutches are all spring-loaded, and if your foot happens to slip off a suicide clutch, it engages the transmission. This made stopping at intersections particularly hazardous, because many of these old bikes had a shitload of torque, and they would not easily stall. So, if the rider hadn't shifted into neutral before coming to a stop, and they overbalanced and inadvertently took their foot off the clutch to stop their bike from falling over, the bike would instantly lurch forward into the traffic. Consequently, this is how the nickname suicide clutch actually came about. Most old British-made motorcycles used a hand clutch and a foot gear change, but not all. And some were just downright confusing. Take Royal Enfield's big V-twin models, the K and KX for example. These bikes mostly had a tank shifter with a foot-operated suicide clutch on the right-hand side, which meant the rear brake pedal was on the left side. But you could also buy exactly the same bike with a left hand-operated clutch instead, and these bikes had the rear brake pedal on the right-hand side. But to really throw a spanner in the works, they were also available with a hand-operated clutch and a right foot gear change.
What the hell?
Which of course meant the rear brake pedal was back on the left side again. Are you confused yet?
You never know what you're going to get.
Back in the old days, with all these different ways of operating a motorcycle, it must have been quite challenging when riding different sorts of bikes. But by the mid-1950s, most manufacturers had changed to the much better foot-operated gear change with a hand-operated clutch. And of course, this method of changing gears is significantly safer, because the rider can keep both hands on the handlebars while changing gears. But right up until the 1970s, there was no world standard for the operation of motorcycles. Some gear levers were still on the right side and some were on the left. It basically depended on what the manufacturer preferred or what country the motorcycle was made in. On some bikes, like the Yamaha YR1350, you could even change the conventional Japanese left foot gear change lever onto the other side. This suited riders who were used to riding British and some American-made motorcycles, which had their gear levers on the right side. I always found it quite bizarre that the old Harley Sportsters had a right side gear change, while their bigger brothers had the gear lever on the left. And this was from the same manufacturer. The Bridgestone DT175 of the 1960s featured a dual transmission. It was a 4-speed and a 5-speed gearbox in one. The rider could select a normal 5-speed or a 4-speed rotary gear change pattern by means of a lever on the left side of the bike. In rotary 4-speed mode, the gearbox would change from top gear or fourth back into neutral. Apparently this was beneficial when riding in the city. While it may have been pretty handy to be able to do this when pulling up at traffic lights, no doubt many riders would have inadvertently over-revved their engines when they were in rotary mode by accidentally changing from fourth gear into neutral, thinking that they were in the 5-speed return gear change pattern. In this mode, neutral was at the top and you would push down for each higher gear and pull up to downshift. Just imagine how confusing it was riding one of these bikes. Thankfully, during the 1970s, the safety Nazis forced gear shifting on all motorcycles to the left side foot-operated gear shift, meaning nowadays pretty much any rider can ride off on any motorcycle. But this just wasn't the case in the old days. So not all Nazis were bad, eh? But I guess on the positive side, it would have reduced the chances of any thieves trying to steal your bike. These days, most motorcycles have multi-plate wet clutches, which means the clutch plates run in oil. However, some Ducati models have multi-plate dry clutches. Let's have a quick look at the advantages and disadvantages to both. Because wet clutches run in oil, there is some degree of drag, which reduces the amount of power getting to the rear wheel. They also make the oil dirtier quicker. But of course engines have oil filters which address this, but it is still a reality. However, because they do run in oil, they also run cooler, last longer, and they have a very smooth operation. On the other hand, dry multi-plate clutches are much more efficient. They get more power from the engine to the rear wheel, which is why these clutches are used in MotoGP. Take a look at this example with both bikes producing very similar horsepower at the crank. But the GPZ 900 on the left gets 3 less horsepower to the rear wheel because it has a wet clutch. Dry clutches, however, can sometimes be a bit grabby, and when they get a bit of wear on them, they can get quite noisy. Some riders hate them, but many others love the mechanics and think they look and sound absolutely awesome. And I'm one of them. Other bikes, like Moto Guzzi's, Urals and the old Airhead Beamers, have dry clutches, which are very similar to what you would find in a car. Because the crankshaft runs lengthways in these bikes' frames, it just makes sense. just like it makes more sense for them to have a shaft final drive. While some narrow-minded riders might say that these engines are old-fashioned and archaic, they certainly still get the job done just as good as anything else. Newer does not always mean better, and this is why some riders even today still change their modern bikes over to a tank shifter because they prefer the vintage old school style. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Anyway, no matter what you might hear or read, in the real world on a road bike, there is not much difference in terms of either reliability or performance of all three clutch types. Like anything, you get used to it. And that's about it. I hope this video has made quite a few things crystal clear for everyone. Cheers.